I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this project. I think the one water, two plans, or one district, two plans, one water is kind of a first attempt at least to try to simplify a planning path for NRDs and DNR and DEQ across the state. What I want to talk about today is from the district's perspective, how we worked up the courage to start down this path, and a little history about our district and the resources within the district. As you well know, all NRDs some are unique in their own ways. We have some commonalities and other things that are unique to each one. The Upper Big Blue NRD, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the upper half of the Blue River Basin in Nebraska, just about our headquartered in York, about 50 miles west of Lincoln here in southeast and south central Nebraska. We cover about 2,800 square miles, and the interstate 80 goes right through the middle of the district, so if you're driving down the interstate west of Seward till you get to Grand Island, you know that this area is pretty highly agriculture and relatively flat. This is a map, of course, of the state of Nebraska irrigation wells. And right there in that circle is the Upper Big Blue NRD, and it's when you put little blue dots on a map, it's solid blue. We have a lot of wells and a lot of irrigation. We'll talk a little more about the issues we have with groundwater and surface water issues as we get ready to talk about how the planning process works. In the Upper Big Blue NRD, groundwater irrigation developed mostly starting in the 1950s with the drought of the 50s. There were a few wells before that, but very few, and most of them were very shallow. By 1960, we had about 300,000 acres irrigated. 20 years later, over 700,000 acres irrigated. And you can see the numbers there, but today we're 1.2 million acres irrigated across the Upper Big Blue NRD, which almost all by groundwater. We have a little bit of surface water, probably 30 or 40,000 acres. And so then we'd like to brag about that. So we are although you hear a lot about the Platte, Central Platte, and the Republicans and some of the districts that have water problems, so far our water problems have been relatively minor, but we are the most heavily irrigated NRD in the state of Nebraska. I found this illustration in 2012 in the drought years. This is a satellite image of the United States. The darker green, the healthier the vegetation, so it's a measure of vegetative health. And you can see the dark green areas in the Pacific Northwest. You can see the areas up in the Great Lakes and into Canada, and those areas are lush, temperate forests that show up very dark green and well watered, so to speak. If you close in on that map in Nebraska, there's also a very dark area, and the eastern part of that area it has the same outline as the Upper Big Blue NRD. It demonstrates the importance of groundwater irrigation to that region. Also, the Central Platte Valley shows up as well, but you can almost see the outline of our district. With 1.2 million acres irrigated corn and soybeans, it's all crops. There's no trees to speak of other than a few along the rivers, but it's very dependent on annual crops. And in a drought year, it shows up on a world map. Our groundwater concerns, as far as quantity go, started with prior to the creation of the NRDs. Previous to the NRDs, we had countywide groundwater districts which measured groundwater levels along with USGS. And from this hydrograph shows groundwater levels from 1960 through the current date, but from 1960 through the early 80s, we saw a steady decline in our groundwater table, coinciding with the groundwater development that was going on, and so people got very excited about what was going to happen in this area. I didn't include those charts, but we had some charts that were predicted by early modelers, both private and public, that we called the doomsday chart. The line just kept going down and down and down. Well, beginning in about 1981, it started to rain. And we also started to convert gravity or gated pipe irrigation to center pivots. And so from 1980 till 2000, our ground, with the exception of a couple years in the late 80s, early 90s, our groundwater levels rose significantly. And during that period, some people find this kind of amazing. During that period, our average annual rainfall increased by an average of 4 inches per year during that entire 20-year period. So I don't know if some volcano somewhere or El Nino or what caused it, but we had a significant increase in precipitation during that timeline. Then 2000 came along, and we've had some drought years since then, and so groundwater levels have started to decline again until recently. But one of the biggest changes that caused that is that when I started working at the Upper Big Blue NRD in 1979, we had about 750,000 acres irrigated by gated pipe irrigation, and we estimated that they were withdrawing between 15 and 25 inches per acre per year. And creeks like Lincoln Creek and Beaver Creek in the West Fork of the Blue River were running bank full all summer from irrigation runoff. And you can talk about consumptive use and things like that, but if it runs to the Gulf of Mexico, it's consumed as far as we're concerned. But since then, we've increased, as I said, to over 1.2 million acres. But this year, our 2018, our average annual water use was 3.7 inches per acre. The introduction of center pivots, improved irrigation scheduling, and a variety of other awareness and education has significantly changed the amount of irrigation or the volume of irrigation that goes on. So we're irrigating almost twice as much land with 1/3 of the water. This is just another illustration of that. We measure over 500 irrigation wells and prepare annual water level change maps like the one there on, I don't know, your left, my left as well, I guess. And then the other map is a GIS generated map that shows where the water is being used based on inches per acre. So we have a fairly tight rein on how much water is being used, and even though we don't allocate water or need to allocate water at this time, we are keeping track of it. One of the things we still are very concerned about is that irrigation efficiency. We can become more efficient with our irrigation. In 2010 to 2014, in this example, 71% of the irrigated acres used 39% of the water, while 61% used 29% of the water. So those that are in that blue area, they still have a lot of room to improve. And we can have a long ways to go on the education side of this issue. Groundwater quality is also a very serious concern in our area. This state map shows based on DEQ's data, where impaired waters are across the state for a variety of reasons. This is the upper Big Blue NRD. You can see we all have similar concerns for one of our major pollutants in the streams is atrazine, with over 1.2 million irrigated acres growing corn. A lot of chemical mixtures, although atrazine use as a whole has been reduced, atrazine is still used in combination with other chemicals because it's a very effective herbicide. But we need to work on, we see the need to work on ways to reduce that pollution load to the streams. Sediment, although again we're a very flat district with that many acres of cultivation, we have some sediment runoff issues both in lakes and in the streams that we would like to deal with. Another issue that is very important to our area is wetlands. The upper Big Blue NRD is basically the eastern half of the rainwater basin. We have, at one time, there were over 200,000 acres of playa lakes in this area. Today, there's probably 10% of that. We are members of the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture with the other NRDs and the Little Blue, the Tri-Basin, Central Platte NRDs, and Fish and Wildlife Service and Game and Parks. And we're very interested in working with farmers who have wetlands and making wetlands, restoring them where possible and making them usable for agriculture in a way that's also beneficial to wildlife and the recharge benefits and water quality benefits that go along with these wetlands. So we've initiated some programs along with the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture to do that, so that this type of issue is not just a burden to the producers in our area, but we can try to complement each other in working towards improving wetland areas. And the big one for us is groundwater quality. We have some significant nitrate issues. Again, not too surprisingly because of the intensity of irrigation and agriculture in the area. We've designated 12 management zones throughout our district that where we have some regulations in place to try to address nitrate contamination. But it's a major issue that is difficult to get a handle on because we need to balance the needs of agriculture, because they need nitrogen fertilizer to grow crops, and also balance the needs of the population so our drinking water is safe to drink. So that is one of the major concerns in our district. This is just another map that shows the nitrates in those management zones. We have one management zone, Zone 5, in the center part of the district, where the median nitrate, half of the samples we take are over 10 parts per million, over the safe drinking water standard. And two others that are approaching that level. Anything over 7, those producers are required to turn in reports annually and do calculations on crop water or crop nitrogen needs based on the university's formula for corn, fertilizing corn. And so we have started regulations on that, but we still have a lot of things we can do if we had the resources to do them. So I called it the pitch. I got a pitch from DEQ and from DNR that the NRD needed to think about doing some planning, both for quantity, integrated management planning with DNR, and watershed water quality planning with the DEQ. And there are various plans that serve specific purposes, but those agencies were looking for opportunities to coordinate these efforts. And so the Upper Big Blue is approached having both water quantity issues and water quality issues at the same time that perhaps could be managed through some joint efforts and attack both issues at the same time. DNR would like to have NRDs prepare integrated management plans for groundwater, integrated management for groundwater, surface water. And the Department of Natural Resources, or Environmental Quality, would like to have the NRDs work with them on what we call a 9-element watershed plan. Integrated management plan looks at groundwater correlative rights and surface water under the prior appropriation system. So there's a system there that they don't necessarily match up with each other. NRDs regulate groundwater, DNR regulates surface water. So through an integrated management plan, we could coordinate these efforts together. That was their pitch. That's a state mandated program, or not it's mandated where a basin or a portion of a basin is considered fully appropriated. That means that all the water that was there is being used. So that defines what's fully appropriated. And then other NRDs could do a voluntary plan where it's not fully appropriated to see if there's ways they can avoid being fully appropriated, also for ways they could conserve water for future uses more efficiently. There are currently all the districts, I believe, I think the Papio Missouri River on this map shows that they're do not have or are not working on integrated management planning, but I think they probably have started that process. So it's a statewide effort, in this case either mandatory or voluntary. A 9-element watershed management plan is a grant funded by DEQ through an EPA grant. The planning process requires, as it indicated, 9 elements, which we'll talk about briefly. And that plan needs to be, once written, needs to be approved by EPA Region 7 to qualify for future project funding in that area. The 9 elements include identification of pollution sources, estimation of pollutant loads in the rivers, streams, lakes, and best management practices that could be used to reach goals, communication and outreach programs that could be used to encourage adoption of those activities, a way to measure their milestones, evaluation criteria for your projects, monitoring to see what's really going on or what improvements you can make, and then technical and financial assistance. So that plan puts all of those things together to prepare for work going forward. Nebraska, there are districts and watersheds that have adopted or are working on adoption of watershed management plans. This map's a few years out of date, but they're continuing to work on those plans. So traditionally, these are two separate plans. That means you go through a planning process for voluntary or mandatory integrated management plan or watershed management plan. They have many of the similar processes to get this done, and also some differences. But the question placed to us, is there a way that we could do this simultaneously? And so the NRD and representatives of DEQ and DNR sat down, I think 3 or 4 times just our staff to talk about the ways to do this. And after some negotiations and working through the process, we decided that we should consider it. So as from the NRD side, we had to think about how is this going to benefit us? What do we gain by going through these processes? So we talked about identifying surface water and groundwater quality issues, which we've talked about here. Identifying potential management practices to address those issues and how to prioritize them. We have a district that covers 2,800 square miles. There's no way we have the resources to attack all the problems all at once. So how do we prioritize those? Similarly, we looked at integrated management planning the same way, and we came up with some of the same, really the same questions. Identify what management problems we might have, identify the ways to prevent or mitigate those future problems, potential problems, and identify potential best management practice to address those issues. So there was a lot of commonalities there that we saw that perhaps we could do this, and really the big one for us was, okay, like I said, we have a large district, a lot of square miles, a lot of problems, or a lot of issues that we'd like to address. So here is a way to access some potential funding sources for the future. So based on those things, we decided to go ahead and start the process. And I'll talk a little bit about the process from my perspective. There are 4 key components: the sponsors, the stakeholders, technical advisors, and what I call hired guns, or a consultant, a planner to help us with the project. The sponsors in our case, of course, Department of Environmental Quality. We received a 319 grant for 60% of the cost of the 9-element watershed plan. With the Department of Natural Resources, we agreed on a 50-50 share on the voluntary integrated management plan, and these are the same numbers. Anyone coming with wanting to do one or both of these would get a similar agreement with these entities, but we're doing it through one process. And the NRD, as the local sponsor, put up 40% of the money for the groundwater quality planning effort and 50% for the voluntary integrated management planning. And those are the primary sponsors for the project. The way that breaks down, the DEQ provide with an EPA 319 grant is providing $146,000 towards the project. DNR's share of the voluntary integrated management planning is about a little over $30,000. The reason theirs is less, that the NRD and DNR chose to write our own plan. In other words, we're using the consultant to help us set from stakeholders goals and objectives, but we're going to write our own plan. Whereas in the water quality management plan, the consultant is doing the lion's share of the writing of that plan, so a little more complex. And the NRD then about $129,000 for a project of approximately $300,000 for the entire planning process. Stakeholders. Stakeholders are the key component for the project as far as, I believe, as far as setting goals and doing things, getting buy-in by your community and your district as far as what needs to be done. So we went out, my staff, early on in the process and identified people we believed were community leaders. We looked at for the ag organizations like Corn Growers Association, Soybean Growers, Farm Bureau, people like that. Then we went to ag business whether it be the co-ops or irrigation dealerships, things like that. Look for a representative from those areas. Went to the municipalities, both large and small. They have a extremely high vested interest in the nitrate issue and in some other of the issues as well. Representation from them. And as we talked about, we have a lot of wetland issues. We went out to environmental and wetland organizations that work in our area and asked them to be part of the stakeholder. And one thing I don't know if anybody else has done in this process, we also look to our public health agencies to provide representation to our stakeholder group. And this is a picture of them hard at work. What the stakeholders did then is they went through all the data. We showed them what we saw, or what DNR, DEQ, and the NRD all thought the issues that might be in this area. And through their programs, we asked them to tell us what they thought the important issues were. And our consultant, our hired gun, in this case it was JEO Engineering Group, put all this on paper, and this was very valuable. I would never encourage somebody to do this without professionals to help them through the stakeholder process. One of the things we tried to do with the stakeholders, and we're encouraged to do, is get a distribution across the district. We're headquartered in New York. It was easy to get somebody who lived in New York or less than 10 miles away to come to a meeting. It's a little tougher when they live by David City or Hastings or Geneva to make that kind of a commitment, because we didn't pay them anything. This was a voluntary effort on their part. But I think we're successful in getting a good distribution of people across the district from a variety of walks of life, whether they work for a city or were a farmer or a businessman, to participate in this process. The technical advisory committee we worked with are really the professionals. We turned to UNL Extension, NRCS, Department of Agriculture, Game and Parks Commission, Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, crop advisors and irrigation equipment sales people that work in our area, DNR, DEQ. We had two of our NRD directors on the technical advisory committee, and then NRD staff. So these were the people who could come to, some of them came to stakeholders meetings and listened and answered questions for the stakeholders, and then also came back together as a group to talk about ways we could accomplish some of the things that the stakeholders wanted us to try to work on. So and I think going on into the future, when we identify individual projects, this group was key on helping us identify ways to solve those issues. And then the hired gun. As I said, GEO Consulting Group was our hired gun in this case. They work with the sponsors to develop, outline, and how to proceed with planning efforts. They organized stakeholders and TAC meetings, facilitated meetings, and organized presentations, consolidate meeting discussion into meaningful goals and objectives, draft those goals and objectives for both the voluntary integrated management plan and the water quality management plan. And they are now in the process of drafting our 9-element water planning, water quality plan. That water quality plan then will be completed soon. In our case, our goal is to submit this to EPA for, Region 7 in May, and should be approved hopefully by the end of June. The voluntary integrated management plan, as I said earlier, we're working to write that. cooperatively with DNR, and we're not under as tight a deadline, so we'll take the goals and objectives that the stakeholders recommended to us and develop our plan around those goals and objectives. The benefits that I see by combining these two planning efforts, our stakeholders got a more holistic view of all the water issues. We're not just talking about nitrates, or we're not just talking about sediment loading in a river or atrazine problems or conserving groundwater. We're talking about all of these issues and how they can fit together in one or two plans, but really one effort to address all of the water issues together in our district. We were able to establish a public-private relationship with those agencies and stakeholders. We're more consistent goals and objectives, because oftentimes things that we do for water supply, like irrigation scheduling, is also a benefit to water quality by reducing leaching of nitrates. Just a simple example, but there are many ways to do that. Stakeholder appreciated the streamlined process. There was a more robust conversation, I believe, more productive meetings. We can duplicate some of the parts of the plans. In each plan, there can be duplication. We don't have to reinvent the wheel again. And the multi-directional learning between DEQ, DNR, and the NRD and the stakeholders, I think, was a very valuable part of the process. A unique opportunity was presented for us to continue doing this planning effort through the district. We were ready for it with the multiple NRD, DNR meetings prior. There was no legislative framework for this integration of water quality and quantity planning. And I think that may be something that going forward we'll talk to legislature about. But if there are stumbling blocks in this process, maybe there is a way to streamline these efforts for others. Many challenges are different frameworks, but overall it was a success, I think. DEQ and DNR are better prepared for future opportunities, continue water quantity and quality planning and implementation. And we say the bottom line, we save time and money. We only had to do this once, hopefully. Special thanks to several individuals. Carla McCullough from DEQ and Amy Zoller from DNR were instrumental in making this work. Rick Wilson and Adam Roop were great leaders from JEO Consulting Group. And thanks to my staff, Jack Wergen, our engineer, and Marie Krausnick, our water department manager, worked hard with presentations and working with stakeholders and TAC members on various issues. And without all of this, we couldn't have done it with our NRD board support. Any questions?
Interesting, Rod. As a planner, I thought that was great to see what you're doing. How did and maybe you're not at this stage yet, but how did, say, the criteria for when certain things management might go into action or something, the criteria for that differ from sort of the previous required water quality and water quantity plans? Are you finding that you're setting the same standards or not?
From my perspective, with this particular district, I think we did most of that planning through our board if they got other stakeholders involved, it was one-on-one, their neighbors talking to them, perhaps. But in this format, we had more open dialogue with people who aren't in our office every day, but are leaders in their communities, so they could take things they learned, we learned from them to us, and things they learned from us back out to their neighbors. I think that was one of our biggest advantages. Some of the goals will end up being the same, I'm sure, but I think we got hopefully we have a better buy-in to the public.
You mentioned that there could be the possibility of suggesting some changes legislatively through the integration of the two planning methods. Were there anything in particular that you saw that?
I don't know, I might have to defer that to somebody else in the room, but I know there, you know, the requirements for a technical advisory committee, that's a requirement of the 319 Watershed program. That's not a requirement of voluntary area management, but I think it's a valuable step. Peace was a valuable piece for us, so there may be some benefits to marrying those types of ideas. There may be other more technical things about when you have to hold a public hearing and when you don't, for different things like that. I think it would be worth reviewing at least. We've tried, in our process, we're trying to make sure we cover both requirements regardless of which plan required it, but sometimes it feels like there could have been some little duplications we could have avoided, but nothing too major.
Hi, Rod. Thank you for coming. It's like all really good ideas, it all seems so obvious when you lay it out. When did you start this process, and about how long would you say it's taken?
That's a good question. When did we start, Amy? Last fall? Well, we started talking probably a year ago, but as far as establishing stakeholders and getting the real process going, probably 7-8 months ago. And we're just about done.
I was curious about the involvement of the stakeholders. Was this a fairly consistent group of people over the 8 months, and how often did they meet?
They met approximately monthly, although we were sensitive to the ag sector of our group. They, you know, when they got into the busy summer, July, August last year, we said we're going to leave you alone because we might not get you to come anyway. You're busy irrigating or whatever. So we skipped a couple months in there and had other things going on, like our TAC group and sponsors and the consultants working on other things like maps and text of some of the technical things that went with it. But our stakeholders were fairly consistent. I think I don't know if we ever had a meeting where we got 100% of them there, but at one point in time we were able to get all of the 18 members we had on our committee at one time or another. We also gave them homework. This was JEO's idea through the process. We didn't just have them come to a meeting, we gave them homework to fill out and questions to answer in between, so that when they came to a meeting, they were prepared for the next topic more so.
Since we have a little time, could you speak a little bit to how you're doing your open houses and public engagement on the plans?
Well, what we did in this case, we just had it last night, so I can tell you exactly what kind of comments we got yet. But we had an open house, and this isn't the first time. Other NRDs have done it as well. It's the first time we'd done it. But we set up stations on all of the 9, didn't have 9 stations, but incorporated the 9-element watershed planning effort in the process we went through. We incorporated DEQ, or DNR had a station on the integrated management activities. We actually had an additional station on some of our nitrate regulations as well, and we invited the public to come in to and just talk. So last night we had about 40 just people off the street. Not that they're just people off the street, but we invited. We had 2 city councilmen and the city administrator from York, city administrator and mayor from Aurora, three or four small towns sent people up. We had several people, farmers from the area. And it wasn't all around York where we were. I had people from Hastings to just south of David City and south of Geneva came to the meetings. We also 13 of our 17 board members were there, so they got an earful from people too, so they see the process. It's not just talking to staff or DNR, DEQ, or technical advisors, but our board members were there to interact with the public as well.
Did the existence of the rainwater basin areas pose any sort of special problems or challenges in this whole process?
No, and I can't say that they did. We talked about wetlands and we recognized the historic challenges that we've had with wetlands. With many of our wetlands have been destroyed in the name of growing more corn. And I understand if you own that land, you want it to be productive. But now I think we wanted to include that in our planning process because the mindset has changed, and we're looking from both perspectives, from those, I'll call them environmental groups for the lack of a better term, that want to preserve or reclaim those wetlands, and from the ag side that recognizes that they can derive benefits from the ag lands. And we're looking at programs like variable rate irrigation, where if instead of trying to force your center pivot through a crop in an area that floods out every 3 years, with some incentives, we can change that wetland now to a productive grazing or haying area instead of fighting it all, having that farmer fight it all the time. And both Rainwater Basin Joint Venture and the NRDs and NRCS have been working toward that. If we put it in these plans, we probably have another potential funding source for those types of activities.
I have a couple of questions. But first, congratulations. I think the integrated planning and bringing stakeholders in at the front end is just absolutely almost unprecedented in this kind of work. People don't usually do that. What have you learned that you think would have been helpful at the start of this process to you?
I don't know if I can have a good answer for that. There were times during the process where I'd hoped our stakeholders were a little more engaged, or maybe 1 or 2 meetings we didn't have enough people show up. I don't know how we get that to happen better, more consistently. Give them beer and biscuits or something. I don't know, but those are some of the things that I would like. That's one thing in particular that comes to mind.
Yeah, the practical. And do you think that broaching this type of very sort of direct and local focused kind of project makes it easier in the future to maybe engage them on thinking about?
Well, that's our goal. That's our goal, because the next step for the watershed management planning and part of the process is to target or identify the most severe problems and target them. So like I said earlier, we can't fix every problem in a 2,800 square mile in one swoop, because we just won't have enough resources to be effective. So this way we can target what the stakeholders and the data from the water quality or quantity identified as the most important thing or the most critical things, put our resources there for a shorter period of time to try to correct or mitigate those, and then move to the next process.
I guess what I'm thinking about is the sort of resiliency, actually, given our recent events in the state. There's obviously going to be a need for a lot of planning on these waterways for thinking about somewhat more extreme kinds of events. And that's a harder thing for people to wrap their mind around.
It is, and I guess I didn't talk about it, but both of these plans are not, they're not static. They're not going, this isn't the last time we're going to do this. In fact, at our open house meeting last night, we asked people to fill out comment cards, and one of the questions on the comment card, would you be willing to be a stakeholder? Because we're going to look at this again in 5 years. So we may perhaps find new people who want to be engaged.
Great, thank you for your work.
Hi, I have actually two questions. The first one, would there be publicly available reports after this ends, like final report, stuff like this? And
Will there be a final report available? Yes, there will be. I don't know when Amy's sitting down here. I don't know when we'll get our part of the work done on the IMP, but we will. There will be the documents for the watershed management plan. Is probably 1 or 2 3-ring binders this thick when you were done, but we'll put together some summary reports.
Yeah.
We're not that far yet. We're just getting to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the second question is, would there be a door for external participants like university students or researchers?
Would there be work for them?
I mean, in the discussions, as a maybe potential interested people in this thing, or it's only restricted to the stakeholders that are involved in this process?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. We are always interested in getting more people involved in our issues. Our district, we're just the right distance from Lincoln. People like to come to York and talk to us about what they'd like to do and what we'd like to see done. We've had student groups come out and talk to us. We've had farmers from Argentina, Brazil, Japan, China. We've had all kinds come through our area to talk about our issues.
Thank you.
All right, any last questions for Rod? All right, well, let's thank him again for coming.
Thank you.